Hello and welcome to the next installment in the series of videos where I have been documenting how I have been taking apart and am now reassembling a Villiers 9E 197cc single-cylinder two-stroke motorcycle style engine with 4-speed transmission and reversible electric starter generator. In this video, my intent is to test the control box for the engine we're working on. That's this control box here. And how I'm going to test this control box is by substituting it for the control box on this engine. I have taken this engine, gone through it lightly. It was an engine that I received as part of a Penguin purchase I made. This engine was not in the Penguin, and until recently I actually had not heard it running. So I've got it running. I think I have it running well. It starts and idles nice, and the generator works. So I think I'm at a point where now I can substitute the unknown control box for the known control box, the control box here. So I'll just demonstrate how the engine runs at this point. Now if I turn, you can't see it, but I've got a simple instrument panel set up. As you can, if you own a Penguin, you can guess that this Penguin has no top on it. This is a Penguin I received more or less in this condition, and I've left the top off of it because it's very easy to put the engine into it and take it back out again to make adjustments, which actually I had to do with this engine. There's the engine compartment opening in the Penguin is normally quite small. The only thing is I've had to make a temporary fuel tank set up here, and I've made a temporary instrument panel, which was actually quite easy to do, and wired it up with a generic ignition switch and a toggle switch to add for reverse engine rotation. So anyway, I'll just start the engine here. So that was forward rotation, and what I did there with the idle speed on this engine is adjusted by adjusting the adjuster on the throttle cable on the carburetor. You may not be able to see it for the fuel filter. But what I did was, first of all, when you turn the ignition switch on, the generator light should light up, and it did. When I started the engine, the generator light went out immediately. So just to make sure there wasn't an issue with the generator light, I slowed the engine idle down until the generator light came on, and it actually flickered with engine speed. So I know the generator light is working, so the contacts in the voltage regulator / generator cutout here in the control box are working. So that was forward rotation. I'll flip my toggle switch here, and when I turn the key on, you'll hear the reversing solenoid clunk. And if I flip the switch while the key's on, that's the reversing solenoid here. So now I'll just turn the key to start. That is the engine running in the opposite direction, or the reverse direction. And the engine runs slightly slower in reverse. I may have the ignition timing not set quite exactly where it should be, even though I checked it. But the engine runs slightly slower in reverse, so the generator light did flicker, so I know the generator light is working, and that depends on the contacts in this control box. So now I will disconnect the battery, take this control box out of the way here, and when I connect the control box we're testing, I will show how I do that and do my best to explain how this maze of wiring is hooked up. It's actually not too difficult if you don't get overwhelmed by the fact that the wires going to the Dynastart are all the same color. Anyway, we'll come back when I've got this control box disconnected and I'm ready to connect our test control box. The known control box, that is the control box that belongs with this engine that I know works, has been disconnected and removed, and I'm ready to begin connecting this control box up. But before I do that, I will just show you something that I discovered. This control box, the one I removed, is exemplary of ones I have seen in pretty much all of the Penguins I've been fortunate enough to work on. And that is that the way the wiring coming out of the control box to the dash works is there are 5 wires: large red, gray, black, brown, blue, and then there's a yellow wire for the neutral indicator light, which I have wired separately here. But the yellow neutral indicator light normally plugs in between the blue and the red one here. So we have 6 wires going to the dash, 5 from the control box, and 1 from the neutral indicator. And if we look on this reversing solenoid, this is a reversing solenoid here, pardon me, we see that there is a white wire right here on terminal B1 that has been clipped short. Now that wire, if you look at the wiring diagrams shown, I believe both in the CEBA operating instructions and the Villiers maintenance manual, which explains most of the CEBA operation, etc., they show a wire connected to this terminal, which is used to operate an indicator light on the dash to show you when the engine is operating in reverse. To the best of my knowledge, Penguins and Beavers did not come from the factory with a light indicator in reverse. Instead, they used this sorry, just got run over by a chipmunk here. They used this wire to connect to an indicator light to indicate neutral. And why I point this out is 2 reasons. If you happen to be working on the control box and you see this white wire clipped off, that's fine, that's intentional. It's because these engines were made for a multitude of purposes. They're adapted for some in different ways, and in this way the wire's just cut off. Now I've also seen, pardon me, this white wire continue out into this loom, and then just it's doubled over and not used. So you would actually see, in this case where there's 2, 4, 5 wires going in, you would see 6 because the white wire would be in there, but you would only see 5 coming out. And that is correct for the Penguin and Beaver, as far as I know. You can, if you want to, use that wire or a wire on that terminal and hook up a light to indicate when the engine is running in reverse, and it looks like that is actually what's happened in the case of this control box. Because in this control box, I discovered when I went to wire this up that there are 6 wires in this harness, and 2 of them are black. So I of course had to figure out which wire was which. I had to sort out the black wires because I knew one of them I was going to connect to the ignition switch, to the ignition terminal, to supply power to the coil, and I wondered what the other black wire was for. Unfortunately, the way this wire was run in this box, it's run outside of this grommet, and it goes directly to the D1 terminal on the reversing solenoid. So someone has decided that this machine should have a light indicating reverse. So I actually, instead of undoing the tape, which should probably be done here, I simply used my little test light to confirm that this wire here in the control box was this wire here, and I marked it with a label maker and some clear heat shrink. I just marked it as REVIND as reverse indicator. So now I'm ready to begin to first explain some of the wiring on this machine. Now the control box connects to the dash. These wires connect to the dash, the ones in this harness in my hand. There's a spark plug wire here from the coil. There's a terminal strip here of wires that connect to the Dynastart on the engine, and there's also one other wire we need to connect to this, and that is we need to connect our battery cable to the 5130 terminal on this relay, which is the starter solenoid, the generator cutout, and the voltage regulator. It's all combined in one box. So I actually have a battery cable here with a small ring terminal on it. I will connect that to this terminal here. Then I'll connect the harness to the engine, and as I've said before, this harness is marked. The wires, if you look at the back of the terminals, are marked. This is marked B2, B1, M, U, R, UV, DF, HE, and A. Now the M is ground, I know that, and the ground is connected to the transmission mount stud, and because we need to connect to a battery, I've also connected a ground cable which will go to the negative terminal of the battery that is also connected to the transmission mount stud. So the control box is connected through the M terminal to the case of the engine, and the case of the engine is also connected to the negative side of the battery. And also these wires here, the UV and the UR are the wires to the points. The R, I believe, stands for reverse. So those, as they're captured in the harness, are fairly easy to figure out where they go on this terminal board here, and the terminals on the board are actually marked, as well as the ends of the wires connected to the terminals on the terminal board. So I should be able to just take the nuts and washers off, set the wires on, put the nuts and washers on, and connect that up. And after I connect the battery cable up, the battery is not connected at this point, just to be clear, and then I can connect the wires here to the dash. I'm just going to go ahead and do all of this. It's a little bit fiddly. There's 2, 4, 6, 8 nuts, lock washers and flat washers to come off. Connect the wires up. I'll connect this battery cable up, and then I'll come back and explain these other wires as I connect them. So the first thing I've connected to our test control box is our positive battery cable. Now our screw is not in very good shape, but I did get it tight. I modified the, sort of repaired the screw slot with my hacksaw. So we've got the battery cable connected to terminal 5130, which is also the terminal that the large red wire is connected to that goes to the dash. I've made sure that nothing on this terminal touches the cover, because that is the wire that goes right to our battery, and if that touches this cover or the base, that would be a direct short to ground, and that is not what we want for sure. So that is connected, so I'll connect our harness to our terminal strip here and come back and explain these other wires. Here we see our harness going to our engine is connected to our terminal strip. The wires pretty much fall into the correct place, and they usually match up the terminal direction. So for example, this terminal, the wire here comes in from this side to this terminal, and as we can see, the wire that in the box connecting to this terminal also comes on this side. So, and here we have two red wires, so we know they're together. These two have an open-ended terminal, so we know they're correct. So it's pretty easy, actually, if you watch what you're doing, to connect this up correctly. So now we'll go to our wires that connect to the dash here, the ones that come out of this grommet, and I'll explain those. Since I mentioned that there are several different, actually there's many different machines that these engines were used in, I will simply explain how these wires that go to the dash are connected to the ignition switch and instrument lights. So I have this wired very much as it would be in a Penguin or Beaver amphibious ATV, only I am using a generic automotive style switch that's used for a battery style ignition system. This is not a magneto ignition system. You cannot use a snowmobile or lawn tractor style switch. It has to be a switch for a battery style ignition, and that means that the battery is actually required for this engine to run, not simply to start it. So we'll begin with the wires here. Our large red wire is the wire that goes to the battery terminal on our ignition switch. This wire has battery power in it all the time, in the sense that if the battery was connected and I touched this wire to this gray wire, the engine would crank over. If I touched it to the case here, we'd have a dead short. So it's very important to be careful. First of all, do not work on the wiring with the battery connected, and second of all, respect the fact that this cable has battery power all the time when the battery is connected. So the next wire we concern ourselves with here is the black wire, not the other black wire as in this control box, but the black wire which goes to the ignition coil. That wire goes to the ignition terminal on our ignition switch. That wire, when you turn the key to on, is connected in the switch to this wire. So for example, if I was to connect these two together, I would now have power to the coil. The next wire I'll mention here is our gray wire. The gray wire would be connected to the starter or solenoid terminal on our ignition switch. That wire has to be connected to battery power to crank the engine over. So if I go back here, if I connect our red wire to our black wire, we have power at the coil. Then if I connected our gray wire, the engine would crank over and possibly start. Then I would remove the gray wire and the engine would continue to run because we're feeding it power to the ignition system. Then to shut the engine off, I would disconnect that. So that's those three wires. So now the brown wire if we go back again, if I was to connect the brown wire operates the reversing solenoid. So what I've done in this machine is I've connected a toggle switch to the ignition terminal on the ignition switch. I've run a wire from the ignition terminal to a toggle switch, and then from the other side of the toggle switch I'm connecting to the brown wire. So what happens there is when the key is turned on, of course the terminal that's connected to this ignition wire is fed power, so I'm taking power from that terminal on the switch, the ignition switch, and when I close my toggle switch, the brown wire gets power and our reversing solenoid, goes clunk, and it does its thing to reverse the polarity of the starter and make sure that the points that are operating the ignition coil are the set for reverse. So if I wanted to start this engine in reverse, like here, right now, I would take the wire with the battery power, connect it to the brown wire. We'd hear a clunk from the reversing solenoid. I would still have to add the power to the ignition. Then, if I touch the gray wire to this, the engine would crank over in reverse and it should start. I would have to actually maintain contact with the gray wire. We have to, the brown wire. We would remove the gray wire. That's just make contact while the key is in the start position. And as long as I hold the black wire and the brown wire against the battery wire, the engine would continue to run in reverse. To shut it off, I would remove the black wire, which would shut the engine off, and then I would take away the brown wire to take the power away from the reversing solenoid. Now the blue wire, the last wire in our harness here, that wire comes back to our generator cutout / voltage regulator. I'm not exactly sure what contacts it works with in this relay here, but what happens is when the key is turned on, the ignition wire is turned on, we feed power from the ignition terminal on the ignition switch to one side of an indicator light, and the other side of the indicator light is connected to this blue wire. So when we turn the key on or we turn the key to start, the generator light, which is what this is for, is grounded through this wire and the generator light is on. When the engine starts and comes up to idle speed, the contacts open in this box as required and the ground is disconnected, so the light goes off to indicate our battery is being charged. Our neutral indicator light works very similar to the generator light in that this wire is connected to one side of an indicator light, and the other side of the indicator light receives power from the ignition terminal on the ignition switch. So when the key is turned on or the engine is running, the power goes through the light, and if the engine transmission is in neutral, this wire is grounded via a contact and pin on the transmission, and the indicator light for neutral is on. As soon as the engine is shifted out of neutral into first or any of the other gears, the neutral indicator light goes off. So that, hopefully in an understandable fashion, is how these wires work and how they're connected. One thing I will note here is that this harness does not have a fuse in it, and neither does the harness in my vehicle. So I'm going to make sure I put a fuse in the harness, in the wire that I'm going to connect to this cable, so that if we have any electrical issues in the way of short circuits, we have a fuse as a weak link to save us from melting anything or starting any fires. Now I will also be using a booster battery connected to the battery cables in the machine using booster cables. I'm not going to bolt this battery cables to a battery. That way I can simply reach down and disconnect the battery quite quickly if there's a problem. So we'll connect these wires up, and I'll explain something on how exactly they connect to the wires in our vehicle, and we'll be soon ready to connect the battery and see what happens. This is the connector on an engine, and to the best of my knowledge, this has not been tampered with. We can see here that the wire colors don't match from one side of this connector to the other. You see the wires in my left hand here are the wires going to the dash, the ignition switch and warning lights. So here we have the red wire coming from the control box, meets with the red wire to the dash. The gray wire to the control box, from the control box, sorry, mates with the yellow wire going to the dash. Then, if we can see it here, there's a black wire mating from the control box, mating to the black wire going to the dash. Then I believe this is the brown wire mating to the brown wire going to the dash. I'll just flip this over the other way here. Then we have the white wire going to the dash. It actually mates to the yellow wire coming from the engine, the neutral indicator wire. And then last but not least is our blue wire from the control box going to the blue wire to the dash. So that is how the wires connect to this connector block in the Penguin and Beaver. Now, as discussed, this is just one way that these can be connected. If you have a different machine, one for example that uses a reverse indicator light, you may have a white wire connected to your white wire instead of yellow wire. But that's the way these machines, the ones we're working on today, are connected. So if you pull this connector out from underneath the edge of the body at the driver's elbow, if you're sitting in the driver's seat, and see these wires don't match, well, that's not necessarily wrong. So again, yellow from the engine mates with white, gray from the engine mates with yellow, mates to yellow. Simple as that. Well, I have taken our red wire and actually changed it to an orange wire. I've installed a fuse holder in the line from the control box to the dash. In my defense, this fuse holder was not installed previously because most of the machines I work on have a fuse holder factory installed in the red wire from the control box. I do believe there was a service bulletin for Penguins to suggest that dealers should install a fuse in this wire to protect the circuits in the machine. So we have our fuse installed, and I put bullet connectors on the ends of the wires in the machine so I can properly and securely connect to the control box. Now I have bullet connectors just like this one here soldered on the end of all of these wires, and what is on these wires is a sleeve like this one. It is an insulating sleeve. This is an insulating sleeve, and it covers up the metal sleeve which the bullets push into. I've got a little solder on my bullet here, so it's still going to go in. So the sleeve goes on the bullet, the metal sleeve goes on the bullet, the insulating sleeve goes on, and now we're ready to connect to the bullet connectors from the control box. So I have 5 wires here. Our 6th wire, the one for the neutral indicator, is already connected separately here, because that's not a wire that passes through the control box. It's just from the engine separately to the dash. So we'll connect our red wire to what is now our orange wire going to the dash. It's usually a red wire. Make sure that's securely installed and the insulator covers everything. Then we'll take our black wire. So the red wire is our ignition, or sorry, our battery wire. If I'm going to explain it to you, I should explain it to you right. We have our ignition wire, black wire, which connects to the ignition wire going to the ignition switch, another black wire. Then we connect our gray wire, our gray wire, which is our starter switch, which connects to the white wire going to the dash. Then we'll connect our brown wire. Now, where I shop for electrical supplies, I couldn't find any brown wire, so I have a purple wire at the dash. Install that connector in there. Then we should have a blue wire remaining that we're going to connect. So, blue wire to the blue wire. This is for the generator light. Now, I'm just going to take a little bit of electrical tape here. I think what I'll do, I just want to cover this other black wire, this remaining black wire. So I'm just going to go into my little bag of bullet connectors here. And I'll just take another sleeve and install it on this wire just to cover that bullet so it is protected from shorting. There isn't really much for it to short on here, everything's fiberglass, but to be on the safe side we'll cover it. So there is the wiring on the dash, or to the dash, connected to our control box. Now I guess I will explain or show the wiring at the dash here, just in case it wasn't clear enough in my previous explanation. What we're looking at here is the back of the instrument panel that I have installed temporarily in this machine, since the machine doesn't have a proper dash. And I've just attached a plate, a piece of strapping with full of holes to a couple of pieces of pipe cut from some exhaust tubing actually, and just held to our support here, our steering bridge, pardon me, with some hose clamps. Seems to work and do the trick. So our wiring from our control box is all here. We should have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have 6 wires. Look at that. And I'll do them, I guess, in the order of importance. Our red wire connects to our ignition switch to the terminal marked BATT, which of course stands for battery. That is power from the battery that the switch will use to distribute to the other wires when required. So the first thing we do when we turn the key to, is that on? Yes, that's on. So when the key is turned on, the switch provides power to the accessory terminal and the ignition terminal. So connected to the ignition terminal is our black wire, which supplies power to our ignition system. That's the wire that goes to the coil. Also on this terminal I have another wire. The color's not really important, but I have another wire going from the ignition terminal to one side of a toggle switch. This is the switch I use for reverse. Since this is a generic ignition switch, it does not have the provision for running the engine in reverse as the original ignition switch did. So I'm using this wire to provide power to this toggle switch, and when this toggle switch is up, it supplies power to this wire, which in my machine here is purple, but that feeds back to the brown wire in the control box. So when the key is on, or actually in start as well, this terminal is supplied power, and this wire supplies power to the reverse solenoid. So when the key is on, power, as I mentioned, is also supplied to the accessory terminal here, and this is where I've supplied power to my red indicator light for the generator and the yellow, or amber if you prefer, light for the neutral indicator. So you could also power these lights from the ignition terminal. I simply felt that the only difference between these terminals is the ignition terminal is supplied power with the key in the on and start position, where the accessory terminal is only provided power with the key in the on or accessory position. Now, I don't use the accessory position, but I simply put the power from the lights, to the lights from this terminal, because I didn't think they needed to have power when the engine was being cranked over to start. And I already had 2 wires under this terminal, so I thought, just to be neat and tidy, I'd give this terminal a job instead of letting this terminal hog all the wires. So when the key is on, as it would be when the engine is running, power is supplied from this terminal to one side of the generator light, and you can see here I also have the wire connected to this wire that goes over to the neutral indicator light, pardon me. And this is where our blue wire connects. This is the blue wire in my hand here from the control box. It connects to the other side of the generator light. So when the key is on, power comes to the light through this wire, and this wire goes back to the control box and grounds it, so this light will be on when the key is on and the engine is not running. Also, if the transmission is in the neutral position and the contact on the side of the transmission is making contact with the pin on the neutral indicator pinion, this yellow wire here, which would actually be, I guess, the white wire in the Penguin, this yellow wire goes to the yellow wire on the engine. This would be grounded, so the power that's being fed from the accessory terminal in my machine here by way of this wire to the light will light this light up. So when we turn the ignition switch on, we get power to light this light and this light. Then when we hold the key to start, these lights go out briefly, and then when we release the key to run, after the engine starts, the generator light should go out and the neutral indicator light should stay on until we shift the transmission out of neutral. And one more terminal. This terminal here on the center of this switch is marked ST, which is for starter. On your switch it may also be marked solenoid, SOL. This is the white wire that goes back to our gray wire at the control box for the starter solenoid. So that's red wire connected to BAT, black wire connected to ignition, the gray wire connected to this white wire, which is connected to the solenoid. Our yellow wire is connected to our neutral indicator light. Our blue wire is connected to our generator light, and both of these lights are then powered, in this case, by the wire I have on the accessory terminal. Now, if this machine had headlights, or the horn was something I wanted to hook up, I would simply connect power to them through a switch for the horn button and a switch for the horn and a switch for the headlights from the accessory terminal. You could also use the ignition terminal, which I wouldn't recommend. You might as well just use the accessory terminal. That way the lights and horn can only be used when the key is turned on. Or you could go right to the battery terminal on the switch and have the lights and horn usable at any time, even if the key is not in the machine. But there we have it. Hopefully not too difficult to understand explanation of one way to wire this engine up to run, and that's the way this machine is wired, and it does work. So I have actually proven it to work. Again, your wiring in your Penguin or Beaver won't look exactly like this because your ignition switch will be different and you won't have a toggle switch. There are wiring diagrams available for the Penguin and Beaver, and also the wiring diagram supplied by Villiers and Seba. If you need any help figuring out the wiring in your machine, I highly recommend finding a wiring diagram, and also whatever manual applies to your machine or the equipment in the machine. Having said that, I guess it's I can't put it off any longer. I'm going to connect the battery, and I'll show you how I do that to make sure we don't have any issues off the bat. As previously mentioned, for actually safety purposes, I am going to use my spare car battery. I usually use a lawn tractor battery, a slightly smaller battery than this, to power the engine in these machines. And I'm going to use this battery connected via booster cables so that I can quickly disconnect one of these cables if there's an issue. And we're testing an electrical component, and if things don't work out as planned, I can quickly disconnect either one of these cables from this battery. I put the battery close to where I'm working, so it should be quick and easy to disconnect if need be. So the other end of these battery booster cables are connected to the cables at the battery box. I've simply connected them, capturing the sides of the battery box so that the cables are not touching anything other than the booster cables aren't touching anything other than the battery cables in the machine. I've kept them clear of the shift lever and anything else that might be aground on this machine. So the first thing I'm going to do is make sure my key is off. Yes, my ignition switch is off. So first thing I'm going to do is test my test light here. Test light lights up. This is our positive battery post with the red alligator clip on it. So my test light does work. So the first thing I want to do is connect the test light between my booster cable and ground. And why I'm doing that is there should be no connections between the positive and the negative right now because the key is off. Of course, the wire that goes from this positive battery cable actually goes, so if we follow this cable, if I was to connect my clip to my negative terminal on the battery and touch here, my light would light up. If I go to the other end of this cable, of course the light would light up. This cable is connected to the positive battery cable at the battery box, so if I follow that cable back to our control box and check the terminal at the other end of the battery cable in the control box, my test light would light up. Under that terminal in the control box is the red wire that goes to the dash. So if I was to pull the connector apart at the bullet where we just connected to the fuse, there should be power there. There should be power on both sides of the fuse, of course, and then if I check the terminal on the ignition switch, there should be power there. But that's as far as that goes. There should only be power along that path, and the power shouldn't be connected to anything else unless, for example, if the contacts in our starter solenoid were shorted or stuck together, that would be a short circuit. The power is taking a shorter path than it should for the situation we're in. So there would be a short circuit and our test light would light up because there would be a complete circuit. There would be a path through the contacts in that starter solenoid, of course through the Dynastart to ground, so our light would light up. To demonstrate, I will turn the ignition switch on, and if I connect this, the light should come on. So the light comes on, the light is off with the ignition switch off. So what that means is, when the ignition switch is on, of course, we have power supplied to two things through the ignition switch, or three things. We have power going to our generator light, our neutral indicator light, and our ignition coil. Now, our ignition coil will only show, or will only draw power if the points in the engine are closed. So, we're not sure why the light is on. It should be on, of course. It's correct for it to be on. It's not on now because the ignition switch is off. But it is correct for this light to come on because we're drawing power for the generator light and the indicator light for neutral. We may also be drawing power from the ignition system. If I was to disconnect the wires one at a time at our bullet connectors, we can see exactly where the power is being used, but this is correct. The power should be used. So, although the light is on and it should be on, it could either be on because everything is fine or because we have a short circuit. So, what I'm going to do is assume that we're fine and that we do not have a short circuit, and I'm going to connect the battery terminal. The good thing is I know that we don't have a short circuit in the, let's say, the supply circuit, which is the cables to and from the battery. We could have a short in the control circuit, which is the switching circuit. So now I'm going to turn the ignition switch on, and I will watch my generator light, and if my generator light comes on and stays on, then we're good to go. If the generator light flashes, then I'll know something has happened and my fuse is blown. So we'll turn the key on, and my generator light is on, so that's good. Now I'm just going to test the reversing solenoid. I'm going to, now that the key is on, we have power running to the switch for the reversing solenoid. So if I flip the reversing solenoid switch here, and I'll just wait for some of this traffic to pass so we can hear it, we should be able to hear the reversing solenoid click. No, we do not. Okay, so I'm flipping the switch here and nothing's happening. So if I leave the switch in the on position for reverse and connect my test light here, sorry you can't see me. I just tested, put the my test light, I connected the alligator clip to the negative booster cable and connected the other side to the output on the wire for our switch, and excuse me, there is power coming out of the switch. So, sorry, actually I'll move the camera here, just bear with me. Now, remember that there is power in this control box. It is live, so we don't want to touch anything except what we want to touch. So now I want to see if we have power on our brown wire, and our brown wire comes in to here. So we do have power here, but yet our reversing solenoid is not not going clunk. So we possibly have, now if I touch the wire here, the end of the wire, the terminal, my test light lights up, so I do have power on the wire coming to the reversing solenoid. If I touch the screw, the light lights up, and if I touch the terminal on the control box here, the reversing solenoid, there's a little corrosion here, so I just want to make sure the power is getting through this connection here because it is a little dirty. So touching the terminal on the control box, there does appear to be power getting to the, sorry I keep calling it the control box, the reversing solenoid. And if I check the case, now touching the case just tells me that there is no open circuit between this case and ground. Just check the ground connections here. So I do not see why our solenoid is not working. So we'll have to investigate that. I'll turn that switch off. And now I'll turn the switch to start and see what happens. Okay, our engine is cranking over. Now, I don't have fuel on here. I'll turn the fuel on. Prime the engine here, just in case. And we'll try that again. It was cranking. Let's see if there's power in the ignition system. Okay, so that's good news. So I cranked the engine over, so our starter solenoid works, and the engine fired and ran. So our ignition coil, although looking a little weary here, our ignition coil is working. So I'll just do one other thing. There's something I forgot to check while the engine was running. I'll start the engine again and see if the generator light goes out. Generator light is on. So no, our generator light does not go out. So we have some dirty contacts, I believe, in our box here. So just checking our reversing solenoid again, still no response from our reversing solenoid. So good news is our starter solenoid works, our coil works, and at least the set of contacts for forward seem to all be working, I guess, except now I was going to say except that whatever feeds the generator light, but I believe I'm just going to disconnect the battery here. So the battery's disconnected. I'm probing around here. The DF wire, I believe, is what controls or tells the generator light to go off. So that's our blue wire, but it is connected to the control box here. It is not connected to our reversing solenoid. So right now it looks like the reversing solenoid contacts are clean. That work, the forward control, or the circuit for forward. So I'll have to do a little digging here. The first thing we want to do is pull the cover off of this solenoid, and there are, see, I've already had to do this on one of my machines. There's one set of contacts for the starter solenoid, and I believe one set for the generator cutout, and then I think there are two sets. So there, let's see if I can explain this better. So there's one contact on each side of the set of contacts for the starting solenoid. I believe the generator cutout has 2 contacts. I believe the circuit just opens, and so it doesn't actually switch from one to another. So there's 2 contacts there, and I think there are 3 contacts on the voltage regulator. Actually, there would be 4. There'd be a movable contact which actually has a contact surface on either side of it, plus 1 other contact on either side of that it contacts with as it moves from one position to the other. So I'll remove this cover and take a piece of very fine abrasive paper and clean up. Well, while I'm in there, I will actually clean up all of the contacts in there. There's no point in just cleaning one set of contacts and then putting this back together and then finding out, oh, now something else isn't working, I should have cleaned those other points. So there are 2 screws in this cover, one here and one here. I'll take that cover off and carefully clean those contacts, but I'll show you as much of that as I can as I do it. So I did convince the cover on our starter solenoid generator cutout voltage regulator to come off. There are 2 screws in it. One goes through this hole, one goes through this hole. Unfortunately, the one through this hole is difficult to access because the reversing solenoid is in the way. So I had to remove the 2 screws that mount this to the base plate here, and to do that I had to remove the 2 screws holding the condenser in place. But anyway, those 2 screws came out, the 2 screws holding this came out, and the screws for the cover came out. Cover with a little bit of wiggling to free up this corrosion. The cover came off. So with the cover off, what we can see, or I can see, maybe you can't see in the camera, is the first part of the solenoid here. So adjust the camera a wee bit. This is our starter solenoid. It's a coil of windings. It's an electromagnet. When we turn the key to start, this coil is energized. It pulls down on this tab here, and you can't see it, but then what happens is this tab pivots here, there's a set of contacts it closes, and we get the engine cranking over. On this solenoid, this is the same thing. It's a coil here that controls this lever here, and this lever has a set of contacts which are normally open, so when there's no power to this coil, this contacts are not touching. When the coil is energized, the contacts close. Now this coil here has 2 sets of contacts, one here and one here, a normally open set and a normally closed set. So I believe this is where our generator light gets its ground, and when I attempt to move this, you may not be able to see it clearly in the picture, but there is a tab here, looks like a steel tab, and a brass tab here which has a contact on it. And when I move that, the steel tab moves to make contact with this other contact surface here, but these contacts don't separate. So I had a hunch that this wasn't right, but not wanting to assume I know everything, because that's where you get into trouble, at least that's where I get into trouble, I dug out another control box I have, and we're looking at the same control here. This is the same solenoid on the starter solenoid generator cutout voltage regulator, and you may be able to see here the normally open contact here, the normally closed contact here with the same double strip here, but when I move that, this contact does separate from this contact. So again, I'm pretty sure that this is where our generator light is getting its ground. So what I'm going to do is get some fine abrasive paper and first of all break this free on the box we're testing, and then close it and rub the paper through it to clean those contacts. Then I'll get a different part of the paper, put it between those contacts, hold them closed, and rub them with the paper, and then I'll do the contacts on this relay and this relay so everything is clean. And then I'll see if I can test this with my ohm meter before I put the cover back on, because I would want to put the cover on, mount this back to the plate so everything's grounded, and then connect the battery up and start the engine again and see if our generator light goes out. So I'll maybe see if I can check those contacts with an ohm meter before I put everything back together. So I hope you could see what I was trying to demonstrate there, but I think we found where our problem is, so we'll see if we can solve it and come back and test it. With a little gentle persuasion from my friendly screwdriver here, I was able to convince this contact here to separate from this contact here. So now we have separation, as they said at the start of the $6 Million Man. So with the contact separated, I took a strip of, I think it's 400 grit wet dry sandpaper. I cut a narrow strip, of course, opened the contacts, put the strip in, and then pulled the strip out. I did that a few times, turned it over so I could clean both the contact here and the contact here. Now, I did say I was thinking of using my ohm meter to check and make sure these were making contact, but I'm going to skip that step. I'm going to trust that they're clean, and actually what I'm going to do is give the contacts just a quick shot of cleaner, brake clean, which is alcohol. It has no oil in it, and then I'll give them a shot of compressed air to make sure there's no little bits of dust in. Then I'll put the cover back on, put this all back together, and test to see if we have a generator light that goes out. So I'll put this all back together, and we'll come back when I cross my fingers and test it again. With our starter solenoid generator cutout voltage regulator back together, the lid on it, so it's secured to the base and the condenser's resecured. Now we'll start the engine and see if our generator light goes out. So go back to our dash here, turn the key on, our generator light comes on, and what I'll do is I'll start the engine, and I think it's idling slow enough that the generator light will flicker, which is normal. If the engine runs too slow, the generator isn't generating enough voltage to charge the battery, so the generator light will come on. So I'll start it and see what happens here. Okay, so the engine did start, the generator light was out, and when the engine was running at a fast enough speed, the generator light stayed out. And then as the engine slowed down and eventually stalled, actually, the generator light came back on. So we appear now to have a functioning generator light. I assume that the set of contacts in that solenoid that were stuck together were the culprit. So that problem has appears to have been solved. So while we're here, we'll just see if there's any difference here. No, and actually, if you look at the generator light as I flip this switch, not sure if you can see it, but I can see the generator light dim slightly as I do that. So I guess next we'll have to take a look at our reversing solenoid and see if we can get that to work for us. So again, here is our reversing solenoid. It has a nice shiny, well, sort of shiny cover on it, and it's held on by a screw here and a screw down there. So I'm just going to move this ignition coil out of the way, take this cover off, and see what we see. Okay, I took 2 screws out of the coil bracket which go through this mount here, and was able to reach in and take the screw out here, and there was another screw here, so that's a screw down here and a screw here, and this cover came off. And what I see here is a whole bunch of electrical contacts. There's a pair of contacts here, actually. There's a contact here, there's 2 contacts here touching. There's one here which isn't touching. There's another contact here and here. And oh, by the way, the battery is disconnected. I did that before I did anything here. So we've got contacts there. We've got 1 pair, 2, 3 pair, and I do believe there's also some underneath. So we've got lots of contacts here. I do believe there is a circuit diagram showing what all these points in this relay do, this solenoid, this reversing solenoid. But what we're looking at here is this center piece here with the contacts on it. It actually has this contact, it has all the contacts on it, or the supports for the contacts, and it should move. And it doesn't. And I'm not really surprised. What it looks like to me is this piece here, which has the contacts on this end for, actually looks like maybe those are for the points switch from forward to reverse. On the other end, it has a ground wire. Sorry, it has a wire to connect it to, yeah, it looks like this terminal here, which is the black wire, which is our coil, so that makes sense that that set of contacts is for the forward and reverse points. So if, say, we opened this up because the engine would crank over but not run in one direction or the other, and we discovered it only had spark in one direction, and the coil, the points checked out, we could come in here and clean those contacts, the one side or the other. So anyway, my point here was that this is a shaft which I believe would spin freely, except there's a little finger on it to go through the hole here, which I believe keeps everything lined up. So what we want to do, if at all possible, is free this up. Now, to be honest with you, I've never run into a seized reversing solenoid before. So I think what I'm going to do is spray some penetrating oil in here, because what we have here is this housing inside would have a coil of wire similar to the coils in here. It would be electromagnetic, and there would be a plunger on this shaft, so when this is energized, the magnetic field in the coil pulls on the plunger and it pulls it in, and there would be a spring in there, so when the magnetic field is turned off, this plunger is pushed back out. So I'm going to spray a bit of penetrating oil down in here, and I'm going to gently put a wrench on these nuts, trying not to loosen them, but just see if I can work them back and forth a little bit to get some movement out of this. I shall just see, yes, that finger would actually remove from that if I needed to, but the plan is penetrating oil down in here, gently work this back and forth. It won't move very much. If I pry that finger out, it may move some more, but I want to get some movement and see if I can get that plunger to go in and out. So I'll work at that and come back with a progress report. Well, I discovered that trying to turn this shaft by using those nuts was a bad idea. I had to, when I accidentally loosened one, I had to retighten it. So I'm going to try a screwdriver in the slot in the end of this and see if it will move. And actually, I already had it moving. I'm just showing you that it is moving. So it's moving back and forth, but we want it to move in, which I think it just did. And it should move out. Oh, look at that. I'm pushing it with the screwdriver and it is moving in and out. Now I'm just going to work it a bit here. It goes in when I push and comes out when I release it, so I don't want to leave the penetrating oil on the contacts because it could encourage dirt to stick where we don't want it. So I'll just work this for a minute here. Well, a moment, not a minute. And then I'm going to turn the camera off here. I'm just going to spray some solvent in here, some brake clean. Again, it's alcohol. It doesn't have any oil in it, so there will be no residue to remain and have dirt stick to it. So I'll do that and I'll come back. I'll have to put the cover back on this, put it all back together, and then I'll see if our reversing solenoid is going to work for us. I've changed the camera angle a little bit so we can see down in here these shiny things. This is the sprocket on the engine, and even though the transmission is in neutral, I can turn the sprocket over by hand here. Even though the transmission is in neutral, I have been noticing that when the engine's running, the sprocket still turns. And of course it turns in the appropriate direction for whatever engine rotation is. So when the engine's running forward, these teeth should go up. And when the engine's going in reverse, the teeth should go down. So I'm going to check and see if our reversing solenoid, as you can see, it's now got the cover back on it. I put the ignition coil back where it belongs. I checked to make sure I did not pinch any wires. Everything I loosened is tight. So we'll connect the battery up. And first we'll make sure the engine still runs in forward. Make sure we haven't undone anything. Fuel is on. Just touch on the tickler there, so go forward. Sprocket moving up at the back, so that is indicating the engine is running it forward. Our generator light is out, so we didn't mess that up. So now we will see if we've had success with our reversing solenoid. So we were moving it by hand. Now we'll see if it will move with the switch. I'll turn the ignition switch on and throw the switch here. Oh, that's it. We have a reversing solenoid making noise. So with it turned on, which means the key is up, we'll turn the key, and hopefully all these contacts are touching, the ones that weren't touching before, and the engine will turn over in the other direction. The correct set of points will get power so they can operate and get spark for us in reverse, and the engine will start in reverse, and the generator light will also go out in reverse. But here we go. Sprocket is turning the other way. Sprocket is turning the other way, and as the engine slowed down just before I shut it off, our generator light came on, so we have the engine cranking and running over in both directions. And our generator light comes on when it should and goes off when it should. So despite the appearance of this control box, the workings in this control box, it does work. Now, it needs more work. It should probably be disassembled and everything cleaned as much as possible, but right now it does work. So when our other engine is ready, the engine we're actually working on, the engine that belongs with this control box, sorry, I'll just disconnect my battery before I forget. So when we have the engine completely assembled, it goes with this control box, I may start the engine with the known good control box. Well, actually this is known good now, but I will just confirm that our subject engine, not this one, the one we're working on, the other one we're working on, when that engine's back together, I will use the other control box, the one for our test engine, to get it running, and then we'll install this control box, and then we'll be able to hopefully have the engine together and running with the control box for it. And at that point we'll say that it's running. Again, this control box should get some more work. Just a note on that, I'll just move the camera here and explain quickly something here. Just a sec, I'll shut the camera off here. The control box for the engine we're reassembling is a little rusty, corroded, because technically where it's aluminum it's not rusty, it's corroded. But anyway, to disassemble that, there's a mess of wires in there, and a lot of them are the same color. So it's easy enough to remove the coil, this relay, the starter solenoid generator cutout voltage regulator, the reversing solenoid, and this terminal strip. It's easy to remove those and leave them all connected. If you take those off, as I discovered, to make a repair to my other control box here, if you take all of those off, the only thing that you have loose is one wire that you have to remember to put back in its proper place. So I'll show you on this other one here. So if we take these two screws out, this one and this one, they have nuts on the back of them. We take those two nuts and washers off and take those screws out. Then remove this screw down in here, the two mounting screws for the coil there, and the two mounting screws for the reversing solenoid here and here. All four of those pieces will come off of this base plate all hooked together. The only thing we have to watch for is a ground wire, which goes between this terminal here and goes underneath all these wires here, and it joins to this, I believe, this screw here. Yes, that one, that has a ground wire on it, but it's too large. So there's a wire that goes between this screw and this screw that will be loose when you take these components off. But if I wanted to take everything off of that base plate to switch it to another base plate, or to have that base plate sandblasted and painted, that would be fairly easy to do. And again, most of these wires are marked, at least where they connect here. So if you wanted to separate these components, I would suggest you take as many photos with your digital camera as you can from as many angles of the wires, the way they connect, the hardware that's there, etc. The way they're routed, like these wires are all routed from this grommet outside of this bracket here. Take note of details like that, and then take things apart and mark them. Now, things like this wire here, this wire is marked on this end B2, and it connects to terminal B2. This one's B1, on our reversing solenoid again, B1. This terminal marked 1 goes across to the condenser. The wire goes across to the condenser. Now it's not marked. The wire on the coil yes, the wire on the coil is actually marked. The terminal, sorry, on the coil is marked 1. I believe those are standard. That's a standard numbering system. But if you have to take this apart to do any work on any of these components, just mark wires as you disconnect them. You may think you're going to remember, but and of course you take it apart, you think you're going to be putting it together in a day or two, and then it's a month or two or more before it goes back together, and for the life of you, you cannot remember where those wires went. Fortunately, there are, I think, some wiring diagrams to help, but I'm very fortunate. I have more than one of these, so if I have to take one apart, I have another example to put it back together to help me figure out which wire goes where. And now with the knowledge that we can spread and make available by the internet, it's not too difficult to find someone, if you look, that has what you're trying to reassemble, and they can help you. They'll be sympathetic to your cause, hopefully, and share some information to help you put stuff back together. But if you can do your best to mark things when you take them apart, it makes life so much easier. Anyway, our test engine is now running on our subject control box, so I think that's going to end this video. I don't think there's anything else I want to test, check, look at before we continue on the other engine. So until we get a piston and cylinder back, I guess that's it for now. Stay tuned for part 11.